Okay, this is the chapter on business opportunities. Hopefully, we got a couple more people just popping in. Not too many questions on this, on the test on business opportunities, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight on our extra class. A real estate license is required if you're selling a business opportunity, if you're negotiating a new lease or including sale of real estate with the sale of the business. So, for example, if you're selling a dental practice where the dentist is just leaving and he's going to sell his book of clients to somebody and he's going to close down his office, not going to get a new lease, not going to sell the building, you don't need a real estate license for that. If you're selling a drugstore that's on a corner and it has a lease, you're going to need a real estate license for that. So if there's no real estate included, you don't need a real estate license to sell it. If there is real estate included, then you do need a real estate license to sell it. The statute of frauds requires that the contract for the sale of businesses in New Jersey be in writing. Any representations or warranties that you're going to give need to be in that contract. For instance, if you're selling a dentist office, you might represent that you have a lot of clients that have been their loyal patients for 20 years. That's your representation. Transfer of licenses, franchise, or distributorships needs to be in there. So, for instance, if I was going to sell you, if somebody was going to sell you a franchise like Subway, they have to have agreement from Subway to be able to transfer the franchise to you. If I'm going to sell you my Subway, you would want me to sign a covenant not to compete. That's where I would promise not to open another Subway nearby. If you're selling a business that had some accounts receivable, you have to make some kind of a allowance for what you're going to do with those accounts receivable when they come in. Are they going to go to you or are they going to go to the new owner? And again, if you're selling a building that has a lease, you are going to have to negotiate assignment of the lease. And I represented somebody who had an eyeglass store, and the eyeglass store had a clause in the lease that said, we will not let you assign the lease. So this guy went to sell his business, and his lease made it impossible for him to assign the lease, which meant if somebody bought his eyeglass business, they'd have to relocate it somewhere else, which made it very difficult to sell his eyeglass business. Next thing, you're going to have to talk about any fixtures that might be in there. And remember, trade fixtures or something that a tenant has in a business, and those trade fixtures are considered personal property. You're going to have to make sure that when you sell the business, it complies with zoning laws. Sometimes when you sell a business, and you're going to have to go and pull a permit from the town to operate the business. Sometimes that particular type of business is no longer allowed. You're going to have to comply with the Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code and the Bulk Transfer Act. So the Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code require the seller to tell the buyer about everyone to whom they owe money with the business. So years ago, I bought a pizzeria, and I didn't do this because I was stupid. And the pizzeria suppliers, Lasante Foods, and my brain just went blank for the other pizzeria supplier, wouldn't sell me any of their pizza products because the old owner owed them money. So that's what this law tries to make so it doesn't happen by surprise. The next law is the Bulk Transfer Act. In the Bulk Transfer Act, if you're selling a business or a commercial endeavor, 10 days prior to closing, you have to let the state of New Jersey know so that they can find out if the seller owes them any sales tax or any excise taxes. Also, what kind of financing is going to be happening with the business? Most businesses are financed by cash or by loans from investors or by the seller producing the financing. And then if you have any equipment within the business, you need to make some kind of a log or inventory of the equipment and how far along that equipment is in its depreciation schedule with the IRS. Just some basic things. Again, the purpose of the bulk sales statute is to protect the purchaser from inheriting any tax debt from the seller. Excuse me. Here's the form that you have to fill out 10 days prior to closing. Give it to the state of New Jersey. If you don't fill out this form, and if it turns out the seller owes taxes, sales taxes, or excise taxes to the state of New Jersey, then the buyer becomes responsible for those taxes. Now, how do you know how much to sell a business for? What is it? What is it a business worth? So all businesses are worth some function of their net operating income. So whatever the net of the business is, a business is worth some multiple of that. For instance, a real estate business is worth 3 times the net operating income. So that means you take all the income that comes in, subtract all the expenses, and what's left is your net operating income. And if you were selling a real estate office, you would sell it for 3 times that amount. There's other businesses that sell for a higher multiple. Restaurants typically sell for about the same 3 times the net operating income. So other things that kind of determine how much your business is going to be worth is how much good faith they have, what kind of reputation they have, all things that really go into how much a business is worth. But the key to how much a business is worth is it's worth some multiple of net operating income. A bunch of businesses on the MLS. These are all smaller businesses like dry cleaners and stores. Bigger businesses, industrial kind of businesses, they're all on these commercial websites called CoStar and LoopNet. And I don't sell many commercial buildings over the course of a year, so I don't belong to CoStar or LoopNet because they are very expensive to join. So again, if you're going to do commercial deals, you might want to find an office that has CoStar and LoopNet. This is a business that's for sale. They're describing the values, the location. And again, it's going to sell for a multiple of its net operating income. So the information that's very important on this kind of a business that's for sale is what is your current net operating income? All right, so that's about it for business opportunities. I have a friend that all he sells is restaurants. He's called Ron, the restaurant broker in North Brunswick. He knows everything about the sale and purchasing restaurants. And my son, since he owns a restaurant and has owned 3 or 4 restaurants, he is very well versed in selling and buying restaurants. So if you really want to know what a restaurant's worth, talk to either Ron or talk to my son, Mike. So let's go to environmental laws. New Jersey was at one time a big manufacturing state. We had a lot of like Mack Truck and Merck, Johnson & Johnson, all with their manufacturing headquarters in New Jersey. And back in the old days, people would just dump their manufacturing byproducts into the ground, into the groundwater or the ground. So we've got a lot of pollution in New Jersey over a long period of time. And we had a lot of production in New Jersey. Our motto on the bridge that goes from Trenton to Pennsylvania is what Trenton makes, the world takes, because we were famous for manufacturing in New Jersey. One of the reasons is we had a very highly skilled and educated workforce. Another reason is we're halfway between Philadelphia and New York. And another reason is Newark Harbor and Port Newark is one of the best and busiest ports in the world. So again, New Jersey did have a lot of manufacturing, less so now because it's moved to less expensive labor sites. But that manufacturing did leave behind a lot of industrial pollution. And so we have a lot of sites that have industrial pollution in them caused by industry, but we also have pollution caused by things like septic systems that leak or people who have oil leaks from their oil tanks that they use to heat their homes. And because of that, there's a law in New Jersey that's called the Private Well Testing Act. Anytime that you are going to sell a property that has a well for the drinking water, and the way the terms we use for that is if you have a well for the potable water supply. If you have a well for the potable, P-O-T-A-B-L-E, for the potable water supply, when you go to sell the house, you have to comply with the Private Well Testing Act. What the Private Well Testing Act does is it requires you to have a well, requires the seller to have a well test done by a licensed company and provide the results to the buyer. Very important. This Private Well Testing Act does not require the seller to fix anything. It just requires them to test and provide the results to the buyer. This test, by the way, costs around $700. When they do the test and they send it out to the lab to see what kind of pollutants you have in your well water. Then they geocode your well. They get the exact location of your well using GPS type coordinates, and they include it on their map. And then from that information, they can make these maps with trends in New Jersey. They can see where there's a trend for certain kinds of pollution. That enables them to help in getting rid of it. It also enables them in being extra cautious in those areas. So again, the Private Well Testing Act, if you have a well for your potable water supply, you have to include a well testing addendum in the contract. What if you just have a wishing well in your backyard and you just use it for maybe watering your lawn? Then no, you don't have to do this. This only counts if you have a well for your drinking, your potable water, your drinking and bathroom water. The next thing is underground oil tanks. And not everybody in New Jersey has gas underground to power their heating system. A lot of towns don't have gas. I live in Colts Neck, it has gas, but there's other towns that don't have gas. There's places that didn't have gas 100 years ago, and so when the house was built 100 years ago, they put an oil tank in the house or underground. And there's a underground storage tank law, and that law applies to all those tanks that are over 2,000 gallons. So if you're under 2,000 gallons, the law doesn't apply to you. Now, what does the law say if you're over 2,000 gallons? Usually that would be like a gas station. And that gas station has to pull out its old metal tanks and put in these new composite tanks that don't rust. Now, you're under 2,000 gallons. Who has tanks under 2,000 gallons? Homeowners. Usually homeowners' tanks are 550 gallons or 1,000 gallons. Each of these three rusty tanks you see in this slide are tanks that were removed from properties I had for sale. On that one property there on the left where it says leak, you can see my head in the shadow as I'm taking the picture. So that tank leaked. All three tanks, you can see that there was a little window cut in the tank. So the way it works is you're going to remove a tank. You have a contractor excavate the tank. The contractor then cuts a window, a little hatchway in the tank. You can see all three of them have the hatchways. Then you call somebody from your municipality to come out from their building department or their environmental department and do an inspection. If a visual inspection does not indicate the tank leaked, then the contractor can just take it away. They take it away and they melt it down somewhere in a foundry. But if it does leak, like the one on the left, then that creates an automatic Environmental Protection Agency file and an automatic lien against your property pending the cleanup of that, the remediation of that tank and any issues that the leak caused. So 3 of them there. One on the left leaked, the other 2 didn't leak. The other 2 were just taken away after they were inspected by the town. The one on the left cost a couple $1,000s to remediate for the leak. So, if you're representing a buyer, tell them to check for oil tanks. If you're representing a seller, tell them to check for oil tanks. And if they have one, get it out before you get too deep into the transaction. Because you can't close on that house until the lien is removed. And the lien, if you have a leaky oil tank, is only removed after you've remediated it and after you've had a geologist come and give you a letter of no further action. And that means that there's no further action necessary to clean up the spill. And sometimes that stuff takes time. So you hold up your closing for months and months sometimes. The next thing we want to worry about on an environmental level is asbestos. Asbestos was used for a couple of things. It was used to wrap pipes, to insulate the pipes. It was also used to make tiles. Many people in older houses have asbestos tiles on the floor in their basement. Those tiles are practically indestructible, and they have asbestos composite tiles as shingles on the side of their house. So all 3 of these asbestos issues can cause asbestosis. This is a pipe wrapped in an asbestos wrapping to insulate it. And you can see on the left-hand side, like there's a little fluff that's popping up there, and a couple other places where there's little fluffs popping up. That's called the asbestos becoming friable. And that friable asbestos then generates molecules into the air. And the asbestos molecule has a radical shape, And if you inhale it and it gets into your lungs, it can cause asbestosis. If it's not friable, if it's not been decomposing like that, then it's not really a health hazard. But if it is friable, it becomes a health hazard. People don't like asbestos in their homes, even if it's not friable, and you would hire a licensed asbestos remediation contractor to take it out. Typically, they wet it down, they scrape it all off, and then they paint the pipes this unique red color that indicates that a licensed professional did it. If you look at the pipe on the right-hand side, the homeowner wrapped the pipe in tape. That's not how you remediate for asbestos. So all that's got to come off, and it didn't save the homeowner any money by doing that. Asbestos causes asbestos cancer when you breathe those molecules into your lungs, because they do have a radical shape that irritates your lungs, and your lungs don't have a good functionality to dissolve things. Another kind of thing that is not a health hazard, this is a tough one, it is not a health hazard, is urea formaldehyde foam insulation. Here's the problem with urea formaldehyde foam insulation. 30 years ago, it was considered a health hazard. They redid the science and studied it again correctly, and they said now, oh, it's not a health hazard. So people still have memories of 30 years ago when it was a health hazard. It is not a health hazard now, but if home inspector says, oh, you've got this in your house, many times it scares the buyer. The next thing is carbon monoxide poisoning. So when you have a natural gas furnace or a gas stove, or you're running a generator in your house to provide electricity, or you're running a kerosene heater, it produces carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide is lighter than air, which means as you produce carbon monoxide, it floats up. And if you breathe in enough carbon monoxide, if you have a high enough concentration of carbon monoxide, you die. Here's an example of a house that was in June 15th of 2019. In this summertime, we had some real heavy storms, and in Burnersville, it knocked out the electricity. This guy wanted to run his refrigerators and his air conditioning, so he hooked up a generator, and he put it in his garage, and it created carbon monoxide poisoning. One man died, and several were hospitalized as a result. Every single year, people die in New Jersey of carbon monoxide poisoning. How do we keep that from happening? We're supposed to have carbon monoxide detectors within 10 feet of every bedroom. And there's all different kinds of carbon monoxide detectors, ones that go on the ceiling, ones that plug into outlets, but you need to have a carbon monoxide detector within 10 feet of every bedroom. And on new construction, and on resales, and on rentals, you're required to have a fire safety inspection done, and the fire safety inspection will check for these things. Also in New Jersey, every town 50 years ago used to have its own dump. You'd have a town dump, and everybody would bring their stuff and dump it on the town dump. But because we have so little land in New Jersey, every town does not have dumps anymore. They send it to like the Edgeboro landfill or another landfill, but those places that had been dumps are still there. And you have a lot of industrial manufacturers that dumped stuff into their property. And so we've got a lot of places that we know have issues with pollution from that kind of dumping. All right, so Cindy asked, what if the landlord was told by the inspectors to place them, but fails to do so for their tenants? So we got two kinds of alarms. We have to have a carbon monoxide detector and a fire safety, a smoke alarm. And we also have to have a fire extinguisher in the kitchen. So if your landlord was told by the inspector to place them, but fails to do so, you just call your municipality and ask to speak to the fire department and tell them that your landlord didn't put any in there. But these aren't that expensive. They're $50 a piece. I would just go out and buy and put them up myself, because I would rather have them up than be arguing with somebody and going to court to get them put up. Now, you might put them up, save the receipt, and deduct it from your rent. And, you know, that's called a repair and deduct. And in New Jersey, you're allowed to do on certain issues, a repair and deduct. Okay, I hope that answers your question well enough. So we have a lot of these sites that are already polluted, but since we don't have much property in New Jersey, a lot of people build on top of those sites. And if you're building homes on top of a site that was formerly polluted, under the Waste Disposal Sanitary Landfill Facility Closure Act, you have to notify and inform buyers that it had been used as a dump and for what period of time it had been used for a dump and what chemicals or what materials were there. That's under the Sanitary Landfill Facility Closure Act. Okay, lead was used in paint to make it harder and to make it last longer. The number one paint that was used in New Jersey in the 1960s and 70s was Dutch Boy White. And Dutch Boy knew that lead paint was dangerous. And so Dutch Boy actually had that little Dutch boy as their mascot to make it look like it was safe for children, but it wasn't. Lead paint causes brain damage and neurological damage if you ingest it. And who ingests it is mostly children. Why do they ingest it? Because it has a very faintly sweet taste. And so children put it in their mouths, they suck on it. Sometimes they bite on windowsills. And since children have such small body masses, the effect, the cumulative effect of that lead paint eventually keeps building up, and it never lessens. Your body doesn't have the ability to get rid of it. It causes neurological damage. So in 1978, lead paint was made not legal. I don't know if you noticed, but when you get gas for your car, you're always getting unleaded gas. That's because prior to 1978, there was leaded gas. Leaded gas was better for some of the components in your car, but it's not legal after 1978. Now, what happens if your house was built pre-78? You have to tear your house down? No. What happens is, if your house was built before 1978 and you're renting it or selling it, you have to give the buyer or the tenant a lead disclosure. And the lead disclosure gives that buyer or tenant the opportunity to check for lead if they want, and if they find lead, they can cancel the contract. Not using this form on a house that was built pre-78 can be a $10,000 fine from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So you want to make sure you always use this form in houses that were built pre-1978. People ask me, my house was built in 1899, and I tore it all the way down to the foundation, and it's brand new from last year, from the foundation up. Do I still have to have the lead disclosure? And the answer is yes, because some part of the construction of the house was before 1978. The next thing is radon. Radon is a colorless, odorless gas that's heavier than air. And radon occurs underground from the decay of a radioactive isotope. And as that isotope decays, it puts off radon gas. And radon gas is heavier than air, which means it sinks. So how does that get up into your house? If it doesn't float, if it sinks? Well, the hydrostatic pressure of the soil and the water underneath your house pushes it up, and it comes up through your basement floor. And even if you've got a concrete basement floor, your floor is even as concrete is a little bit porous. And so the molecules come through. Now, again, they're heavier than air. So they're sitting on the floor of your basement. And if you use your basement, your kids go down and crawl around on their hands and knees and play in the basement, it could give them cancer. It could give them the same kind of effects that you would get from getting too many x-rays. So what do? We test for radon. And if we think there's radon in the basement floor, we dig a canister. Why do we dig a canister in the basement floor? Because radon's heavier than air. So that means it floats down into the canister. It sinks into the canister. And then we use a vent pipe and pump it outside on the roof line and disperse it into the atmosphere. And then it's outside in the lawn, but it's not concentrated, and it gets blown around by air, so it's not a problem. And you don't really spend too much time on the dirt in your backyard, crawling around on your hands and knees, breathing it. So the acceptable level for radon in New Jersey, and this is a federal level, so it's all 50 states, is 4 picocuries per liter. Picocuries is a measurement of how much radiation there is per liter of air. Picocuries, is a measurement named after Madame Curie, who discovered radiation. And Madame Curie died of radiation poisoning. Also, a name that died of radiation poisoning from playing around with Madame Curie and taking x-rays of themselves and fooling around with radiation was Nicholas Tesla. You've heard that name, Tesla. So that's what happened to him. So Madame Curie, again, discovered radiation. They named the measurement after her. 4 picocuries per liter is the acceptable level. You're selling a house, the buyer does a home inspection, and he finds radon. Does the seller have to fix it? No. It's all part of the negotiations as a result of the home inspection. And if they do fix it, they retest it and make sure the level is under 4 picocuries per liter. The next thing is electromagnetic fields. So this is a house in the middle there, this ranch I did a BPO on, an appraisal on, and there was high tension wires running behind the house. So high tension wires, what tension means is high voltage. Through those lines with those big towers runs electricity at very high voltage. And anytime you run electricity through a line, through a wire, it creates an electromagnetic field. And there are people who believe that that's a health hazard. What people believe that? Well, Denmark believes that. That's why in Denmark, they don't carry their phones, especially men, in their pants pockets, because you have especially sensitive cells around there. But in the United States, we don't believe electromagnetic fields are a health hazard. So they are not a health hazard. However, because there's a perception that birds die from sitting on them all the time, there must be something wrong. Those kind of high tension wires behind your house reduce your property value. And when we get to the chapter on appraisals, we're going to know that that's a form of external obsolescence. Something outside of your house that reduces its property value, that's a form of external obsolescence. But they are not a proven health hazard. Next is mold. Mold forms in the presence of moisture and the absence of light and airflow. So that means something is getting wet and there's no air going in and no light getting on it, no sunlight getting on it. Each of those spots of mold you see there have millions of microorganisms. How do you get rid of mold? First, you get rid of the moisture, you dry it out. Second, you wash it with bleach and water. But even if you do wash it with bleach and water, if there's millions in each of those dots, you're always going to miss some and they're going to come back. So the real best way to do it is to cut all that sheetrock out and then re-sheetrock it. Make sure you've gotten rid of the water source, otherwise it's going to come right back. Now, you hear a lot about black mold being a health hazard that's really bad. There's multiple different species of mold. The black mold they talk about that's such a bad health hazard is not in New Jersey. It's down in Louisiana, where it's warm and humid, but not in New Jersey. The species we have most often in New Jersey will trigger asthma attacks or may hurt people who have certain allergies, but it's not such a health hazard as it is the really dangerous strains that are in the southern states that are very humid and hot at the same time. But again, home inspector sees mold, it scares the buyers. Typically, the buyers will ask the homeowner to remove the mold. And again, the best way to get rid of that mold is to cut out that sheetrock and make sure there's no more source of moisture. So now we're going to look at pollution on a larger level, like an industry must do, and not a homeowner. This is industrial pollution. And they passed a law in 1980 called CERCLA, CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This was a law that wasn't designed to punish people who polluted, but it was a law that designed a mechanism to get people to pay for cleaning up polluted areas. So it created a Superfund sites. CERCLA is not a regulatory statute. It is a cleanup and liability law. It cleans up abandoned or orphaned toxic sites by imposing strict cleanup liability on those parties responsible for creating them. And it includes everybody in the chain of ownership, which really stinks because you might not have polluted the land, but because you were in the chain of ownership, you might be considered responsible for cleaning it up. Not a great law. So in 1986, they passed S.A.R.A, S-A-R-A. S.A.R.A is the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. They extended and amended CERCLA. They list certain extremely hazardous chemicals that must be reported to authorities when spilled or released. But the next important thing they did was they gave what's called innocent landowner immunity. Remember, CERCLA applied to everybody who ever was in the chain of ownership. S.A.R.A said, listen, if the pollution was caused by somebody besides you, and you acquired the property after the placement of the substance, and you did not know about the problem, and you had exercised due care to see if there was a problem, and you missed it, then S.A.R.A releases you from the obligation to clean it up. So you get what they called innocent third-party immunity. The next law we want to talk about is I.S.A.R.A. This is, again, is for commercial endeavors. It's the Industrial Site Recovery Act. Every type of commercial endeavor in New Jersey is given a code. And so let's say you're selling a hotel. And I sold a hotel in Perth Amboy. The code for the hotel said that the hotel was very unlikely to pollute. And because of the level of the code, I did not have to do an environmental statement and study on the site. However, 2 blocks away, I sold a gas station. And the I.S.A.R.A code for the gas station, for any gas station, indicated you got to do a environmental study. And 2 blocks away at the gas station, of course, the gas station had leaks, and it was a major cleanup caused by it. That's I.S.A.R.A, Industrial Site Recovery Act. All right, this is a question that's always on the test. New Jersey is the most densely populated state. It's more densely populated than Japan, if you can imagine that. And we have a lot of environmentally sensitive areas in New Jersey because we have so much water surrounding us. We have the Delaware River, we have the Atlantic Ocean, we have the Delaware Bay. So lots and lots of water surrounding us. In addition, under the pine lands in New Jersey, we have a giant underground lake. It's called an aquifer. Has really clean water in it, a giant underground lake. And so these laws are all meant to curtail overdevelopment in environmentally sensitive areas. So we have the Highlands Act, the Pinelands Act, Wetlands Act, all different laws to protect environmentally sensitive areas. And what they do is they keep you from being able to build on a lot of different places in New Jersey. And this is a New Jersey Pinelands land capability map. And there's a lot of areas where you can't build. And again, we're a densely populated state, and we lose that much more by these laws. So what are the purpose of the environmental laws like the Pinelands Act and the Wetlands Act? It's to curtail overdevelopment in environmentally sensitive areas. All right, so I always like to show this slide because we do have a responsibility as real estate agents to our environment. So things we always have to look out for is underground oil tanks. We have to look out for lead. We have to look out for radon. We have to look out for asbestos. We have to look out for mold. We have to look out for wood-destroying insects like termites, powder post beetles, and carpenter ants. All those things you'll become aware of. And a home inspector's job is to kind of find them. Some home inspectors hire an additional person to do an inspection that specializes in wood-destroying insects. A FHA loan will not allow you to buy a house unless you have a termite certification that says there's no existing termites. But all of these things, there's no rules that say the seller has to fix anything. All of these rules really just speak to the fact that the seller has to disclose their knowledge and that the buyer will have the ability to cancel the contract in the event they find one of these environmental hazards that they don't want to deal with. Another quick thing to note is home inspectors, for the most part, and I hope there's no home inspectors on the call, on the class tonight, because they suck. Home inspectors are just looking for very obvious things, and then they're always telling you when they find a very obvious thing to have a licensed professional check it out. And many times home inspectors scare people away from the deal, and they lose a house that otherwise would have been okay for them. In New Jersey, there's very few things that you should really be terrified of. You could be concerned about certain things, and everything can be fixed. But home inspectors sometimes ignite a basic primal fear in buyers. And that's why I say there's a lot of them out there that I don't think do a good job. They also make you sign a document that says that they're not responsible if they get something wrong, which really, really irritates me. Now, speaking of home inspectors, they have to be licensed in New Jersey. If you were going to use the results of that home inspector's report to renegotiate your transaction. So in other words, if you have your uncle come in and do a home inspection, he's not licensed, you can't get out of the deal if he finds bad things. But if you use a licensed home inspector and he finds things that affect the safety or habitability of the property, then via the home inspection contingency in the contract, if the seller will not repair things or give you a credit, you can get out of the deal. Again, I want to remind people, if you take the test and you don't pass, send me your scores so that I can kind of look at what you need and tailor a class exactly to that. You're going to have 6 questions on property ownership, tenants in common, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, condos, and co-ops. There's 4 questions you'll absolutely have. 4 questions on land use controls. So the Municipal Land Use Act requires you to have a planning board made up of 7 or 9 members. And there's also in municipalities, the zoning board and the zoning board of adjustment. They set the standards for the uses and the sizes of what you can build. On valuation and market analysis, 6 questions. You can count on question number 1 being, how do you value a church? That's the cost approach. Question number 2 is, how do you value a apartment complex? That's the income approach. Question number 3 is, how you value a house? That's the comparable sales method. Question number 4 is, if your subject property has 4 bedrooms and you're using a comparable that has 3 bedrooms, and a bedroom is worth $5,000, so your subject has 4, your comparable has 3, and a bedroom is worth $5,000, what is the adjustment? And we're going to use the rule I for I, increase for inferior. And the comparable is inferior because it only has 3 bedrooms. So your adjustment to the comparable, because rule number 1 is never touch the subject, your adjustment to the comparable is to increase the comparable by $5,000. So you'll have a question like that. You'll also have a question as, what happens if the cap rate goes up on a property? What happens if the cap rate increases? Well, if the cap rate increases, the value goes down because the cap rate and the value are inverse proportions, right? Its value by income is equal to the NOI divided by the cap rate. So value is on the top of the left and cap rate is on the bottom of the right, which means they're inverse functions, which means as cap rate goes up, value goes down. Okay, that's a question that's typically on the test about valuation and market analysis. And the last question on that will be, in the event you've done your appraisal and you've got 3 different values from the 3 different methods we're using, comparable sales, income, and cost, then what do? Well, what you do is you give your opinion of value. You don't average them. You give your opinion of value with a narrative to define why you gave that opinion of value. Those are the most often questions on valuation and market analysis. Financing, you're going to have some questions. What loan requires the lowest down payment? And the loan that requires the lowest down payment is a VA loan, as little as 0 down. On a conventional loan, how much do you have to put down in order to not pay PMI? Typically, you have to put down 20% to not pay PMI. They're going to ask you what kind of a loan allows a builder to release one of the properties when he's finished building it and sell it. And that's going to be a blanket mortgage, because a blanket mortgage has a release clause in it. Another question they're going to give you is, what is the total of all the payments on a 30-year fixed loan? And again, on a 30-year fixed, fully amortized loan, 30-year fixed, fully amortized, the payments are the same every month. So your total of all your payments is 360 times your monthly payment, not including taxes and insurance, just for principal and interest. Also, on the financing question, they are going to give you some questions about how much income comes from an investment of $100,000 that has a 10% return. And $100,000 with a 10% return, how much income is going to come if your principal is 100,000 and your rate of return is 10,000? You're going to multiply 100,000 times 0.1, so you're going to be $10,000 a year in income. They're always going to ask you what's the income by the month, so you're going to just take that $10,000 a year and divide it by 12. General principles of agency, 10 questions. And it's hard to have 10 questions on agency. First of all, if you're a seller's agent, who is your customer? If you're a seller's agent, the buyer is your customer, because the seller is your client. If you're a buyer's agent, who is your customer? If you're a buyer's agent, the seller is your customer, because the buyer is your client. If you're a transaction broker, who is your customer? And the answer is both, because if you're a transaction broker, no one is your client. Another question that comes up is, when do you have to disclose your agency relationship? And that's at the first meeting, or if you're mailing information to somebody, or if you're on the telephone before the next meeting with the person, or if you're on the telephone and they're asking for specific information, then you have to disclose your agency relationship. Another question on agency is, when somebody has power of attorney and they are somebody's attorney in fact, how do they sign a contract on behalf of their person? And they would sign it. If John Smith had been given power of attorney, he would sign everywhere John Smith as attorney in fact for Miles Standish. How do we terminate an agency relationship? So we can terminate agency relationship by expiration of the agreement. We can terminate it by death of the client or death of the broker, not the salesperson, because the broker is the one who is truly the agent. We can terminate it by renunciation, by revocation. And the best way to terminate agency relationship is by completion of the objective, doing what they wanted. A couple other questions is, a seller signs you to be their real estate agent. What are you going to be? What you're going to be is a general agent of your broker and a special agent of the seller. A general agent of the broker and a special agent of the seller. Property disclosures, 5 questions. Wells, the Private Well Testing Act. Lead, the form for the EPA for lead if your house was built before 1978. The Sanitary Waste Closure Act says if it was used as a sanitary waste disposal site, you must notify. The other questions that might be on about property disclosures is the law about disclosing if there's any sex offenders in the neighborhood. Somebody asks you if there's any sex offenders in the neighborhood, you are not allowed to say anything. What you have to do is you have to instruct that particular buyer to, after closing, go to the prosecutor's office and get a list of the sex offenders in the neighborhood. Let's see what the next contracts. We're going to have questions about an option contract. Who has to perform on an option? The buyer performs at his option. The seller can be forced to perform. An option contract is a unilateral contract. Only one party must perform, and that's the seller. A normal real estate contract is a bilateral contract. Both people have rights and responsibilities. On a contract, what happens if one party doesn't do what they say? That's called a breach of contract. What are the remedies for breach? The first remedy is rescission. The second remedy is actual damages. The next remedy is specific performance. Specific performance is when the courts compel you to do what you promised to do. What are the essential elements of a contract? Must have an agreement to do or not to do something between competent parties, 18 sane and sober, supported by consideration. Something of value has to change hands, and it must be able to be enforced by law. Those are the essential elements of a contract. If you write a contract on a purchase of real estate, how long does the real estate agent have to present it? 24 hours. How can a contract offer, an offer, be terminated? An offer can be terminated by acceptance, because then it becomes a contract. An offer can be terminated by rejection. An offer can be terminated by withdrawal prior to acceptance. An offer can be terminated by death of the offeror or the offeree prior to acceptance. An offer can be terminated by impossibility of object, which means you make an offer on a property and it burns down, your offer is terminated. And it can be terminated by mutual agreement, ways a contract can be terminated. When we talk about leasing, they're going to talk about the different names for different leases. And we have a periodic estate, or month to month. How much notice is required? 30 days. We have an estate for years. That's when you both agree on the beginning date and the ending date. How much notice is required? None, because you agreed on the beginning. And what kind of a lease is terminated on the sale of the property, the death of the landlord, or the death of the tenant? That is an estate at will. And if that estate at will isn't terminated by those specific things, then there needs to be 90 days notice. Leasing and property management. If you are a property manager, you are a general agent, you have a broad range of responsibilities over a long time. You need to have a property management agreement in place when you start. The very first essential element in that property manager's agreement is your fiduciary duties. And that's where the owner of the building is naming you as the person, the agent that is responsible for that building. Transfer of title. That's the chapter on deeds and title insurance. So in New Jersey, we use a bargain and sale with covenants against grantors acts deed. That's also known as a special warranty deed. What kind of a deed does not have a covenant of season? What kind of a deed does the grantor not say they're the owner? That's a quitclaim deed. What are the essential elements of a deed? You don't need to have a date, but you should have a date. A legal description. Deed must have a legal description. That's a metes and bounds description. A deed must have a grantor and the grantor's signature. A deed must have a named grantee, but the grantee does not sign it, he just gets it. A deed must have a recital of consideration, how much you're selling it for. A deed has any reservations or warranties in it, and it has a habendum clause in it. And then in order for the deed to transfer ownership, it has to have delivery and acceptance in the here and now. In order to be a competent grantor on a deed, you've got to be 18, sane, and sober. What do you do with the deed? As a buyer, once you get it, you record it. What's the purpose of recording it? To serve as constructive knowledge or constructive notice. On title insurance. Title insurance in New Jersey is paid for by the buyer. It insures the buyer and the buyer's heirs for purchase price. Buyers and the buyer's heirs for purchase price. Practice of real estate. A real estate broker has to have a trust account. He has to have an operating account. Into the trust account go other people's money. Somebody gives him a check to go into the trust account. How soon does it have to go in? Within 5 days. If somebody bounces a check for the trust account, what does the broker have to do? They have to notify all parties. Who can have a trust account? Only the broker can have a trust account. What is it called when you put money of your own as a broker into the trust account? That's called commingling. And you're not allowed to do that except for small amounts of money that you put in to maintain minimum balances. Who can pay you? Only your employing broker can pay you. How is it determined how much you're going to get paid? That's going to be dictated by your employment agreement. What are the essential elements of your employment agreement? That's the 4 required things. It can have more than 4, but the 4 required things are your amount of how much you're getting paid, your amount of commission, what your split is, a promise to pay you within 10 days. The broker's got to pay you within 10 days of receiving the check. A statement about your termination. What happens if you leave sometime between the time something is under contract and it closes? How much are you going to get paid? That's your termination agreement. And it must have a statement that says that everything that is written in your employment agreement is binding over things that are oral. So you have a disagreement with your broker about what you're supposed to get paid, you look at what's in writing, and that's what determines it. Before you can begin work, you have to have an employment agreement signed under laws created by the United States government saying that a real estate agent, if they have a real estate license and get paid commissions, and a commission that has to be at least 75% of their pay is by commission, if that's the case, then they are treated as an independent contractor as far as tax laws are concerned. How long does the broker have when you quit to terminate your license, or he fires you? 5 business days to terminate your license when you quit. How long does a broker have to keep records for? 6 years, with the exception of 6 months for offers that were not accepted, or contracts or listings that expired. Offers that were not accepted or listings that expired. All right, real estate calculations. You're going to get a couple of questions on commissions, a couple of questions on closing statements, prorating credits and debits. And we'll go over that next week. I'll put together a couple of exercises on prorating credits and debits. Remember that they tell you on the test how many days are in the month. Usually they tell you that for all your calculations, use 30-day months. You're going to have a couple questions about rate of return on properties, a couple questions on somebody paid so much for a property and it went up 5% every year for 5 years. What's it worth now? So you're only going to have 4 to 6 math questions, and they're relatively easy. So again, we'll go over a couple of the proration questions next week. Duties and powers of the real estate commission. They can fine you up to $5,000 for a first offense and up to $10,000 for subsequent offenses. They can suspend you, or they can revoke you, or they can put you on probation. The Real Estate Commission also looks at the law as it was written by the legislature. The legislature wrote the law. The law is called Title 45, Chapter 15. And the Real Estate Commission decides on the amount of fines. They decide on the time frames and all that kind of stuff. So they fill in all the details on what's called the bare bones law that was written by the legislature. 8 commissioners, 5 are brokers who have been licensed for at least 10 years, 2 are members of the general public, and 1 is the governmental designee who serves at the pleasure of the governor. They serve 2-year terms. Licensing requirements. To get your salesperson's license, a 75-hour class, 18 years of age, have legal presence in the United States. Don't have to be a New Jersey resident. However, if you are not a New Jersey resident, you must sign an irrevocable consent of service. To be a broker, 3 years experience immediately preceding your application as a broker, with no more than 25 hours a week in any other job. You have to take a 150-hour test class. You guys are only taking a 75. A broker's got to take a 150-hour, take a new test and pass the test and be fingerprinted again. And remember, if you get charged with a crime and you get convicted, you have to let the real estate commission know within 30 days. Except if you get charged with burglary, forgery, theft by deception, you have to let the real estate commission know as soon as you're charged. Statutes and rules governing licensee activities, that's the kind of things that you're allowed to do if you have a license, and the kind of things you're not allowed to do if you don't have a license. And what is your responsibility in terms of your duties to people? If you're somebody's agent, remember you're going to owe them old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accountability, reasonable care, and diligence. This is a tough 22 questions because they're going to be asking you questions about things like if a seller wants to give you a special tip and they want to give you $1,000, can they? And the answer is no. Somebody's asking if they can have a recording of this class. The answer is yes. I am recording it tonight, and we're moving along pretty quickly. So I will put this together and get it to you before the next class.
Thank you. Yes.
Oops, let's get on to the next one. Additional requirements. Those are things about closing your office. In order to close your office, you're going to have to let the real estate commission know. You'll have to de-identify. That means take all your signs down. You're going to have to make sure that any monies that are in your trust account are taken care of. Remember, your trust account has to be reconciled every 90 days. So once a quarter, you have to reconcile your trust account. Only a broker can have a trust account. Can a trust account be paying interest? The answer is yes, but not to the broker. The interest has to be paid to the person who is depositing the money in the trust account. In the event, again, a broker goes into a trust account and takes out money and spends it on himself, that's called conversion, and that is also illegal. Putting a broker's money in, we talked about earlier, is commingling. Taking money out of the trust account, spending it on yourself is conversion, and that's illegal. All right, so actually that's it for tonight. That's all I have planned. I did record this, and so I will give you guys a copy of it. Let me stop the recording now so it doesn't go on with our comments here. It's easier said than done.